Historians speak of the long 19th century, running from perhaps the French Revolution in 1789 through the beginning of World War I in 1914. And it's a little bit longer than 100 years, so it's the long 19th century, but sometimes events, historical periods don't confine themselves to the pages of the calendar that we use. And so we may come to think when we look back on 2020 of the long 2020, and not just because it felt like it took a long time to get through 2020, because 2020 may have lasted into the first week of 2021. There was the refusal to concede the presidential election from November forward. There was the continued growing of political tensions that exploded this week. And there was the final resolution of those Georgia Senate elections that were so momentous. Those all took place in this first week of 2021, and maybe that inflection point of January 6th, just a couple of days ago, will decide what the theme of 2021 will become. Will it be the story of a Black senator and a Jewish senator coming from Georgia? Or will it be the barbarians storming the gates of the US Capitol? Well, it remains to be seen. Now, as those who have heard my year in review talks before know, I like to bring back some names you might have heard of over the course of 2020, but may have forgotten along the way. They're people who had their 15 minutes of fame and everybody knew them, and then they're lost to the sands of history, but not necessarily. So because we're on Zoom, I can actually do this in a poll format. I've put together a list of 8 names here, asking you which ones do you think you know, why they were briefly famous. It's the 15 minutes of 2020 fame poll. You can answer more than one. And so go through and take a look at the names and see which ones you think you know, and then I'll tell you the answers in a minute. But we can take a couple of minutes just to look through and see which ones you think you remember from 2020. Okay. Volodymyr Zelensky. He was really important the first part of the year. Everybody learned how to pronounce his city. It's not Kiev, it's Kyiv in Ukrainian, because he is the president of Ukraine, who was squeezed, led to an impeachment. Derek Chauvin. Well, if I'd given you the name George Floyd, you would have known it. Derek Chauvin is the police officer who was on George Floyd's neck. Rudy Gobert, I knew this one would challenge some people. He is a basketball player for the Utah Jazz. He was the first case of COVID diagnosed in the NBA that led to the canceling of that game and ultimately the crash stop to the NBA season in the middle of March. His diagnosis was March 11th, and everything came to a halt within a few days after that. Marie Yovanovitch, she is also Ukrainian connected. She was the American ambassador to Ukraine, who also refused to play ball and had that riveting testimony in front of Congress. Now, a lot of people seem to know Qasem Soleimani. His name was in the news in the last week or so because it's the anniversary of the airstrike that killed him, January 3rd of 2020. He was an Iranian general thought to be behind a lot of the pro-Iranian militias in Iraq that have been targeting US soldiers and Iraqi government officials. I knew Jacob Kornblue was a bit of a deep dive for some people. Jacob Kornblue is a reporter for a magazine called The Jewish Insider. He himself is an Orthodox Jew, as is the audience for that magazine, but he's someone who has outed events that do not follow social distancing and masked and number of attendees guidelines. And he's even pointed out communities that are not following these guidelines in print, in public. And over the course of the year, he was actually threatened. People came to his house. He was assaulted in public because that community didn't want to have their name sullied. They didn't want to fix the behavior either. We had a case actually in the Chicago area just last month in December of a wedding in Northbrook that was well over 50 people without masks, without distancing. And there's a real division in the Orthodox Jewish community today, both over COVID restrictions and behavior and also over Donald Trump, who is much more popular among Orthodox Jews than he is among non-Orthodox Jews. And even within the Orthodox community, there's a strong division of opinion. Mark and Patricia McCloskey, well, if I'd shown you a picture of them, her holding a handgun and him holding an AK-47, standing outside their large mansion in St. Louis, you would have known exactly who they were. So now you know who they are. And finally, Brad Parscale, he was Donald Trump's original campaign manager. And that didn't last. He was fired, and he also managed to make a lot of money while he was the campaign manager. He bought a Ferrari and some other things. So you have to wonder how much of the candidate's best interests he had in mind. So now you can see the results of what people guessed they knew. Most people who voted thought they knew Soleimani. Very few knew Gobert and Jacob Kornblum, but that was to be expected. This is supposed to be the year in review, reminding you of all the things you forgot about 2020. But has anyone really forgotten 2020? It seems like on one level, it's unforgettable. There are things we'll never forget. And at the same time, sometimes the days blended into a blur, and January and February before the lockdown feel like another universe. In late January, the Trump administration released their Israeli-Palestinian peace plan that went nowhere. In February of 2020, I flew to Los Angeles for a weekend seminar. I spoke to dozens of people in several separate events, and it feels like another universe. 2020 began with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu indicted for corruption, the US President Donald Trump impeached for using foreign aid to extort Ukraine to produce political dirt, and both of them stayed in office through all of 2020. Throughout 2020, we still had our usual catalog of ordinary and extraordinary events. In May, SpaceX had their first launch of a manned crew capsule that made it to the International Space Station, including recovering the first stage rocket, which is their specialty. On August 4th, in the port city of Beirut, there was a massive explosion with that chilling video. You might remember seeing the shock waves blasting through the city. They had been storing ammonium nitrate in the port for years, and a fireworks storage went off and set it ablaze. Racial justice was a strong theme of 2020, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor and many, many more. There were books that made it onto bestseller lists. There were public marches in large cities and small cities. I participated in one in Highland Park, Illinois. And there were even serious discussions about police reform and police reforms that actually took place to make our justice system more just. There were serious arguments all over the country about Confederate statues and renaming military bases. And Mississippi finally removed the Confederate emblem from its state flag. Though I'm curious if you remember what they replaced it with. They replaced it with the phrase, "In God we trust." Well, so as human beings, we're happy to see the Confederate flag go. As humanists, we might not be so thrilled to see "In God we trust" added to the flag. The NFL franchise in Washington, D.C. is now the Washington football team, no longer the Redskins. Though perhaps we should admit that reading books or changing names is easier than addressing structural systemic problems. So we have to get beyond the cosmetic too. Mother Nature did not take a break in 2020 either. The Australian wildfires that raged from July 2019 to March 2020 burned 46 million acres, affecting over 1 billion animals. On May 4th, we had the arrival in the United States of what were called murder hornets. They're called murder hornets because they kill bees, but in numbers, they're also dangerous to people. There were locust invasions in India and Africa. There were earthquakes and major storms in Turkey and Puerto Rico. There were floods in Indonesia, tornadoes in Tennessee and Arkansas and Mississippi and Alabama. And until mid-March, we had the typical American human-caused tragedies of mass shootings and sports losses and TV awards shows. And then everything changed. The first US case of coronavirus was announced in January 21st. It appeared in numbers first in Wuhan, China, and then in Italy and South Korea. And then there were the cruise ships, and then the big cities. And well, you don't need me to tell you the whole story. You lived it. The first American death was confirmed on February 29th in Washington state. By mid-March, you had the global shutdowns of everything, even the Olympics. We had such a wide variety of national and local responses. There was Sweden's attempt at herd immunity. There were New Zealand's very strict controls and large success. Brazil's President Bolsonaro protesting along with the public about shutdowns as a populist. And of course, in the US, 50 different states had 50 different responses. We learned all new vocabulary. To the verb to zoom, I'm zooming. We now know what that means. And the related concepts of Zoom bombing, showing up to mess up a Zoom meeting, or Zoom fatigue, running out of gas after several hours on the computer. We also had other new verbs like potting, I'm potting with this family, or doom scrolling, I'm going through looking at all the terrible news. We learned new phrases too, social distancing, contact tracing, and how to flatten the curve. And that last one, unfortunately, we know the phrase, but we didn't learn the behavior. So I want to show you a couple of the statistics around coronavirus. I don't want to dive too deeply into this, but to get a sense of the progression of the year and how the curve was not as flat as we wanted it to be. So this first one is an animated graphic that will show you the number of infections week by week. It's not adjusted for size of population, it's just the raw number of cases, but you can see how different countries faced it differently at different times. And so this is just a minute long to watch this. Well, if there's a lesson for that, it's weird number one in the wrong way. This is where we are today. This is a description of which states have rising rates, which states have rates that are flat, and which ones that are falling, the general trends. And we also have these charts of cases over time. On the far left, you have the number of tests being conducted. That's gone up in a good way. The number of cases that have been diagnosed, and that's unfortunately gone up and down a little bit, then up, and then down a little bit, and then up, and not down yet. The number hospitalized has also had its ups and downs and currently on a massive spike. And unfortunately, the number of deaths as well is having another resurgence. What has been the result of all of this suffering and diagnosis and illness and death? Well, we've simultaneously become more reliant on and more skeptical of social media and even of our neighbors. What are the proper health standards? What are the standards for being safe in a space or being with other people? What are the media standards that the social media is presenting? How are they enforcing them? What kind of warnings are they putting on them? Are they offering alerts for content or not? How do they handle misinformation? Fake news that's really fake news? And are they in charge of policing civil discourse? We had to learn how to make risk assessments all the time. What can be done with bars and restaurants, hair salons and gyms, movie theaters and grocery shopping? I remember the shock I felt when I went into a grocery store and they'd taken off the one-way aisles. They had been one-way aisles, and I thought that's what makes you safe. And then we're back to two-way aisles. And what is this person doing so close to me again? Is it even safe to take in the mail? Is it safe for our kids to go to school? Not because of shootings. This was a record low for school shootings, but because of the disease in the air and what they might bring home with them. And there were real conflicts. This really was a case of a zero-sum game between health concerns and saving lives and freedom of movement and behavior. The more free people moved and behaved and the less they masked and distanced, the more disease would spread. And that restriction of freedom of movement and behavior also meant restricting economic activity. Now, some people felt no financial impact whatsoever. Maybe they're retired, and so they had to deal with groceries and deliveries and so on, but it didn't affect their working life because they weren't working. Maybe some people were already working at a distance remotely, and it didn't change their work pattern at all, other than having to negotiate kids as well as working. Other people were in jobs that could transition to working at a distance. And some people were in jobs or owned businesses that simply could not be done at a distance. A gym, a massage parlor, a doctor's office, a dentist's office, a hair salon, or a restaurant. Now, there were some unanticipated benefits as well. Our vaccines were developed in record time. We learned to see the stars again and to have animals come back to places they hadn't been for a long time. One reporter mentioned he went to take photos of a mall that was empty, and it's a place that's never empty of people, and he heard birds singing. And he said, I never knew there were birds at this mall because you never heard them with all the people talking. We had distance family gatherings by video. They were not as good as being in person, but in some cases, their reach was wider than being in person because we could do it by video, and regardless of time zone or difference, it could work. We could have done it before, by the way, but nobody knew how to use Zoom. I've had this experience planning funerals with families. Now everybody can participate in the planning meeting, even if they're not going to be there for the service, even if they're in Sweden or in another part of the world. They can be part of that meeting to share memories of the person they loved that can then become part of the memorial celebration of their life. And just maybe we got a little bit less vain about our hair, its length or its color. And maybe we were a little more appreciative of things that we've taken for granted. Oh yes, and 2020 also had a national election on top of everything else. Well, when I made my predictions for 2020, there were some things I totally missed. I'll be honest, I totally missed a global pandemic, but I guess most people missed a global pandemic. I also missed the explosion of issues around racial justice. I knew these were issues, of course. I didn't expect the massive shift in public opinion, in popular action, in legal activity, and so on that came about this year. But when it came to American politics, I did make some predictions, and we'll see how they turned out. So last year in January, I said the impeachment trial of Donald Trump will result in a narrow acquittal, but there will be some fireworks over whether witnesses will be seen or not. I said in the presidential election, the Democrat, whoever it turns out to be, I wasn't dumb enough to pick who'd win the primary, but I said whoever the Democratic candidate turns out to be will beat Trump. He will be a relatively narrow electoral college win, but a wider popular margin. And the Senate, I said, will be split 50-50. Now, there was not a blue wave, as the polls had predicted. We know that the polls were wrong because polls are based on a very basic assumption. Polls are based on the assumption that people have a phone, they answer the phone, even if they don't know the number, and then they will tell the truth to a stranger. None of those are true anymore. People don't have home phones. They don't answer strange numbers. Mine is set up to not even let it ring. And if I actually get someone on the phone, I'm not going to tell them the truth. Think about the old adage, don't talk to strangers and don't get in strange cars. Now we call strangers to come pick us up in their strange cars. However, on those three predictions of the impeachment, what would happen with the election and the Senate, I did pretty well. I even called the 50-50. Now, I also looked forward to Israeli government issues. It was just after the third election that Israel had had in a row, and the blue and white party, I predicted, would form a government without including Arab parties in it, but that government might not last through 2020. As it turned out, that government formed with blue and white and the Likud party failed to pass a budget and collapsed in late December 2020, announcing yet another set of Israeli elections coming up in March of 2021. Now, lest you think I'm Nostradamus all of a sudden, I also predicted that during that year in Israel, there'd be some progress on synagogue and state issues. Survey says, I said that they'd be a little bit nicer to the non-Orthodox because the blue and white party was more pluralistic. I said there'd be no progress on peace in the Middle East. On that one also, in a positive way, I was wrong. There's still a stalemate with the Palestinians, to be sure. But there was actually real progress regionally with some relations normalized between a few Gulf states and also with Morocco. And Morocco actually will be a very popular destination for the tens of thousands of Israeli Jews who hail from Morocco, who came in the 50s and 60s, who have shrines of their beloved rabbis and saints that are buried there. They'll go back for pilgrimages. It will actually be a very positive connection between Morocco and Israel in the near future. So I was right in one and wrong in a few others. And in terms of global war and peace, I said, well, relations with Iran will cool down. No, wrong. And I said there'd be another hotspot that would flare up. Think about Syria and Turkey. We had that battle for a while. But in the end, COVID shut down just about all of those war and peace issues and international affairs. So what do I predict for 2021? Well, when it comes to COVID-19, good predictions tend to extrapolate from known facts. Even though, stockbrokers will tell you past performance is no guarantee of future return. So for easier math, let's say we're going to vaccinate 200 million Americans. There's about 330 million people living here, but the vaccine is not intended for children, so that's about 75 million children under 18. And some are unable to take it because of allergies or other responses, and some will refuse to take it. So let's say for easy math, we have to vaccinate 200 million Americans. That means giving out 400 million doses because each person gets 2 doses. So far, since December 14th, we've given out 6 million doses, which is about 240,000 per day. Now, if we kept that rate of 240,000 per day, it would take us 1,667 days to vaccinate everyone. That's about 4.5 years. But remember, past performance is no guarantee of future return. We've been promised that we'll get up to the rate of 100 million doses in 100 days. So let's say we do that, and at that rate, we'll be done much sooner. It'll only take 394 days to vaccinate everyone. Now, we've been told that herd immunity benefits start at under 100%. Let's say it's at 70%. It takes us about 280 days. So we might begin to see some kind of normalcy by the late summer and the fall, but probably not until the end of the year. And of course, between now and then, there will be a lot of sickness and a lot of stress and a lot of death between now and then. Yes, past performance is no guarantee of future return, but we're at 360,000 people dead in this country, and we're still rising more than a 9/11's worth of deaths every day. In fact, we hit 4,000 per day just this week. Now, in terms of American politics, I might have made some predictions before this week, but after this week, who knows? Anyone who claims they do know what's going to happen is probably selling you something. What happened on January 6th was the culmination of 2020. It was the end of long 2020. On one hand, you had progressive activism by young people and for racial justice that led to the election of a Black Democratic senator. Remember how South Carolina saved Joe Biden's primary campaign, especially with the African-American voters coming out for him. And we also had a 33-year-old white Jewish senator coming from Georgia. So that's the youth activism and the racial justice question. That's one culmination of 2020. But the other culmination of 2020 also took place on January 6th. It's the paranoid style in American politics, ramped up by coronavirus stress and lockdowns and ongoing economic dislocation that's been accelerated by automation and social distancing. And altogether, it's not an accident that there were Confederate flags and anti-Semitic paraphernalia in that invasion of the Capitol. Hating people and blaming an enemy is always very tempting. For Jews in America, wariness is the price we pay for our Jewishness. And that won't change overnight with a change in the White House. Remember that 10 to 15% of the American population that was anti-Semitic over the past 30 years was emboldened by Charlottesville. And they're still emboldened today. And so we'll have to deal with that too. But I want to end with an image that is both upsetting, but also in an odd way could be inspiring. You may have seen this picture of one of those protesters making their way into the Capitol building carrying a Confederate flag. What Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis were unable to do, these protesters were able to do, to bring in a Confederate flag. Now, what's fascinating about this picture is not just the juxtaposition of that flag in that space, but the particular portraits that are captured at this moment as well. And I don't know if the photographer knew it, but it's amazingly resonant. On the left, the white-haired gentleman you'll see is a portrait of John C. Calhoun, who was one of the Lions of South Carolina. He was a senator. He served in Andrew Jackson's cabinet. He was a staunch defender of states' rights and a very vocal and active defender of slavery. In fact, in the last couple of years, my alma mater, Yale University, renamed one of its residential colleges, which is no longer Calhoun College. It's now named after Pauli Murray, who was a theologian and an African-American woman who graduated from the Divinity School. Calhoun was a Yale undergraduate. He was famous enough to get a college named after him, but no more because the tide has changed. So on the left, you have John C. Calhoun, the Lion of the Confederacy before there even was a Confederacy. And the portrait on the right, that's Charles Sumner, who was in the House of Representatives from the state of Massachusetts. Sumner was a staunch abolitionist who advocated for abolition vocally and sometimes viciously from the floor of the House. And after one debate, he had so insulted the honor of a delegate from South Carolina that 2 days after his speech, the delegate came up to him at his seat in the House and beat him mercilessly with a gold-headed cane, so much so that the cane broke with the force of his vehemence. Sumner himself was laid up and took 2-3 years to recover before he could return to the House. And it became a symbol of a rallying cry for both the North and the South. People from the South sent the delegate who had beaten Sumner hundreds of replacement canes for the one that had broken. But Sumner himself became a martyr to the cause of abolition and ultimately to the cause of the Union that eventually won the day. And then he went back into the House. He stayed there through the period of Reconstruction, and he advocated for the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments and the imposition of martial law where needed to enforce Black voting rights in the South. But then the cause was lost again with the end of Reconstruction and the imposition of Jim Crow. The tide rose again with the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. You see, like a wave, we rise and we fall and we rise a bit higher again. And if we feel this week that we may be near the bottom, one of the worst moments of our political experience, watching those violent scenes, we can have hope that the rise is beginning. It may have begun that same evening when Congress reconvened and fulfilled their constitutional duty and took the most important step to turn the page into 2021.